Australians are still waiting for Labor to release the basic details of the voice, but it's not for a lack of trying from opposers of the proposed legislation. Our favourite Senator, Alex Antic, asked a simple question about who will be able to qualify for the voice. This was the unsurprising response from Labor Senator Anthony Chisholm.
No, we're not talking hypotheticals.
I know what you're seeking to achieve. Quite frankly, it's borderline racist, some of your questions that you're putting here.
Is it really?
Yeah,
to ask the question about how someone identifies and how it is that the legislation, the framework does that in a practical, that's racist, is it?
Borderline, yes.
Borderline racist, is it really?
The path that you're going down.
Is it really? Yeah.
If that's where you want to head, Senator Antic.
Well, I just want an answer. I mean, what I'm looking for is a simple answer.
Senator Alex Antic joins us now. Senator, always terrific to see you. Yet again, you've held the spotlight, the blowtorch to Labor and to the left and to the woke. You asked them last year, what is a woman? They couldn't answer that. You asked the very simple question that without which there can be no voice. What is an Indigenous Australian? You asked that question in Parliament and you got called a racist. Tell us about it.
Well, yeah, thanks, Rowan. And look, I'm just asking simple questions because I'm a simple man ultimately, and I mean these are fundamentals, though. Really, I mean, it starts from the very top. Really, I mean, we're being told that we need to change our constitution dramatically and drastically in order to allocate people based on race. So let's put aside the issue of that diabolical idea of dividing Australians on race on its own, and let's start having a look at some of the details. Who actually qualifies? What does it look like when someone says, I wouldn't mind going to Parliament to represent my people, but I've got a great-grandma who was Greek and a mother who was Italian and a father who was whatever. So what does it actually look like? What's the intention, and how far back do you have to go? And I started asking questions which apparently drifted into borderline racism, which was, extraordinary from a bloke who's second-generation Australian. But there you go. Welcome to the world of 2023 identity politics. And I asked the question: well, if I'm 5% Aboriginal and 95% Irish, Scottish, then do I qualify? Nobody could answer that. All I got from the 60 bureaucrats in the room was assertions about there being a long-standing test, a 3-part test, which all basically comes down to people self-identifying and being accepted by their community. Now, that raises so many issues. We won't have time to talk about them all today. But take, for example, what happens if you genuinely are a person of Aboriginal descent, but your community rejects you because you share a different political view? Do you then just not become Aboriginal? And this is the problem with breaking Australians up by race. As you said in your introduction there, it's absolutely insidious. I go to Parliament because I'm an Australian. It says so on my passport. We're all Australians. People need to say, I say no to the voice, and rejecting the voice and saying no to the voice does not make you a racist.
Rita.
Well, I saw that footage that we played and other discussions during that same day have gone viral, and the activists are pushing it very heavily on social media, being outraged by your questions. But like you said, it seems like we're in this perverse situation where anti-racism is considered racist. If you want to treat everybody the same based on their character, not their ethnicity, that's now racist. And what is being understood to be racist is apparently now virtuous and what we should all be doing blindly. I mean, where are we in this country?
Look, it's very, very confusing, Rita, confusing to normal Australia who are just fed up with this nonsense. And you're absolutely right. You're over the target. You've hit a soft spot when Twitter starts reacting in the way it's done. That is when... Yeah, that's exactly right. So, but these are questions that should be being asked by our political class, by the way. And part of my frustration is I spent a bit of time in the week prior with Professor Peter McCullough, who's an eminent cardiologist from the United States, who came here to talk about the COVID situation and what had happened. And he said he came to Australia on the assumption that Australians were like Steve Irwin and I would say Albie Mangles, being a child of the 80s. And he turned up and effectively every Australian was just getting a rainbow flag waved in their face, getting called a name, and they're shying away, don't touch me with your... Yeah, that's the problem. This country has got to toughen up, and it involves getting people back into the culture, pushing back on this stuff respectfully, having the argument, doing it in your corporate boardroom. I've said it on this show 1,000 times before, and getting involved in the political process. We need to get people into Parliament that stand for these issues, that push back on them. We did it in South Australia. 18 months ago, I started on the potentially career-limiting, job-destroying path of trying to reintroduce Conservatives back into the Liberal Party in this state. We've done it from the ground up. We've introduced thousands, and on Friday, we as a result of that, we elected Ben Hood, who is going to be the Ron DeSantis of South Australia.
Ooh.
Watch out, lefties.
Fantastic. You heard it here first. You heard it here first. James.
Big call, but Alex, Senator, I want to ask you about, just go back to that hearing that you had over The Voice and everything. Now, I got to say, if they did any more gaslighting on this thing, it would trigger the safeguard mechanism, okay? That's how big the carbon emissions would be. But are we saying now that should this thing get up, and it's looking less likely by the day, but if it were to get up, that the AEC, the Australian Electoral Commission, would have to have a separate roll of voters who are identified as being Indigenous Australians, and that therefore we would have the government, the federal government, and a respected, one of the world's best administrators of elections, dividing us by race.
Yeah, well, you tell me, James. Nobody seems to know any of these answers. I sat for 15 minutes almost trying to get answers like that during that Senate estimates questioning, because they are very relevant questions. And I don't know the answer to that, but I presume they would have to. And so the question then becomes, who qualifies for it? What does it actually look like? You know, we've had instances, time immemorial, where people have identified as Aboriginal who actually aren't. That's not fair to genuine people of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent. This is not some sort of great big bureaucracy for the, for the benefit of inner city woke white people, and that's what it's going to become. It's as simple as that. So there are so many questions that we don't have time to cover them all off. That is a very good one, and I'd like to know the answer.
Now, so I want to get this straight, in who can participate in the Voice process, vote and also be a representative. So say I'm a woman who lives in a remote community. I'm not Indigenous by heritage, but I've married an Indigenous man. I've given birth to Indigenous children. I work in the Indigenous community. I advocate on their behalf. Am I able to put my hand up and say I want to be a representative to this Voice to Parliament?
Well, that's still, as I was told on the day, we're still working on those details. We'll get back to you. Poor old Anthony. Like he got in there. I don't think he was ready for that barrage. He looks like he needs a great big hug sometimes. So I didn't want to push it anymore. But look, these are the questions that come up. And somebody raised this very issue with me the other week. People who are, seventh generation Australians who've been working in Indigenous communities, they don't know. They might have a tiny speck of Aboriginal in the background somewhere, maybe.
But what if I don't?
Accepted.
What if I don't? What if I've done my genealogy? I know my family tree. I don't have Indigenous heritage, but I've given birth to Indigenous children. I'm married to an Indigenous person. I work in the... Am I not qualified? Is it that race-based that nobody, no matter how intimately involved they are in the community, is able to participate if they don't have that at least, tiny percentage of Indigenous blood?
Yeah, well, in many instances, it's self-identification. So, you might well suspect somewhere in the background that you did, and you just sign a stat deck saying you did. I don't know. These are the questions that come up. But what if I'm an honest
person and I don't do that? Then I don't qualify,
well, I know you're an honest person. No,
well, obviously, if you've got no Indigenous blood, Rita, you can go and write a book all about the history of Indigenous Australians, and that'll qualify you. Just being facetious there, Senator. What was really telling for me in that interview there was the way immediately you were accused of being a racist. I thought that was disgusting, because
Absolutely.
Calling someone a racist is like calling them a pedophile or calling them this or a murderer or whatever insult you name. You were asking for technical details, very simple. What is the test? Who qualifies? I can't go and get a driver's license without doing X or Y. I've got to qualify through X and Y. You asked one simple question, and this Labor minister, I think you're too kind, it isn't a hug that I'd be giving him, but anyway, comes out and calls you a racist. Seriously.
Borderline
racism. That's just appalling.
Well, I mean, I think actually what he said was the line of questioning was borderline racist.
Same
so
thing.
To be fair, yeah. Look, I mean, it's a nonsense. I mean, that is just ridiculous in itself. And I mean, once again, this is the problem with where we're up to today. When there are no answers and when there's no line of questioning to come back with, the name calling begins. We've seen it wherever. I mean, if I wanted to just board a plane and not be surrounded by rainbow flags, I would have been called a homophobe, presumably. And it's a very simple way out, and it is disappointing. But like ultimately, that's I don't mind. I don't care. I'm happy to be called whatever. I can imagine, though, that Australians on the street wouldn't like that too much for their own selves, and that's how you shut down the debate. That's how you shut it down.
James.
Well, that's right, Senator. You can call me anything, just don't call me a cab. But there's another thing I want to play from these hearings here about climate change. Have a look at this.
Mr. Pizzullo, your opening statement, which I've got in front of me, you made mention of the fact that the department's work extends to dealing with the effects of climate change.
Yes.
And to better position Australia to deal with the increasing exposure and vulnerability to nationally significant crises, including those due to climate change. With the greatest of respect, is that comedy, parody, or is that serious?
I'm not sure. Are you referring to the question that you've asked me? I don't understand.
No. The suggestion that the Department of Home Affairs is somehow prioritising the issue of climate change. Is that a serious...
Well, I'm not sure if you've noticed the increasing frequency and severity of weather events.
So, Senator, let me get this straight. Here. The big thing Home Affairs shouldn't be concerned about isn't, Chinese infiltration of our institutions. It shouldn't be Russian spies. It shouldn't be all of these other global security threats in this increasingly dangerous world, nuclear proliferation, terrorism, what have you. No, apparently, Home Affairs is out to change the weather. Tell me about this.
Yeah, look, I wish I could, but the seawater's lapping at the front door here. And I've got to get out of here. So, no, just a joke. Very serious problem. Don't worry about cybersecurity and all that sort of stuff. Look, I don't know. Once again, without wanting to be too untheatrical about this, Mr. Pizzullo does do a good job. He's a very good administrator. He's been lumbered with this nonsense sandwich by the Labor government. I mean, this legislation has been put through and he's been caught with it, so presumably he has to defend it up on the big stage there. But let's be clear, this is stupid. This is a nonsense, right? We have real problems out there. And whether or not there is some agency somewhere that wants to talk about climate change, it ain't Home Affairs, right? They are dealing with bigger problems than that, I'm sorry to say. And, this is the problem. People are now starting to see the reality of having elected this Labor Greens Teal alliance. These little tentacles are infiltrating the bureaucracy everywhere. They are. And in fact, you ever want to see a better example of who's running this country, come to Estimates during an Estimates week and come down to the cafeteria and look at who's running the country. This country is run by the unelected now. We are seeing them getting infiltrated with this stuff. And, we need a strong political class. We need people to get involved in politics and elect strong leaders to control this bureaucratic class as well.
Absolutely.
So I don't know. I cannot tell you. I don't know. I'm just, it's bizarre.
And Senator, you make a really good point there because, of course, Mike Pizzullo is a well-respected administrator in Canberra, but he is laboured with this government that he now has to serve. We saw another example of this a couple of weeks ago when he basically had to play cleanup for the government when there was a suggestion that they had ignored advice around TPVs as well. So we're seeing, I'd love you to speak to this, the quiet radicalism, I guess you could call it, of the Albanese government undermining in different ways the security of Australia because, of course, Defence later said that they were getting ready for the boats.
Yeah, and look, I mean, it's creeping across the entire bureaucratic class. You can almost feel a sense of relief 9 months ago amongst them. There are obviously many very good bureaucrats out there as well. But, on the whole, Parliament House in Canberra is now starting to look like Ultimo in Sydney now. And, there's a dress code now and I don't fit in. I've always, of course I'd be an odd fish out. But it's true, like they are... There's a very different agenda that's permeating through, and the real power, just like it was in Yes Minister, for everyone that watched that back in the good old days, nothing has changed except they're bigger and badder now. And, there are more of them, and they wield an enormous power in this country, and you can see it in almost every single department, of which there are far too many, by the way.
Well, one department, of course, is the health department. This is the health department that, Alex, last year you asked them if they could tell you what a woman was, and they fell all over themselves trying to do that. Well, on the question of vaccines, you asked some pretty simple questions about their vaccination status. And, you know, you've got people who lose their jobs at airlines and supermarkets and elsewhere on the basis of the corporations being allowed to access people's private health data. Yet here, the health boards themselves took offence, took umbrage at you asking them their health data. Have a listen.
Is it your position, therefore, that these vaccinations are still safe and effective?
Yes.
How many injections have you had, Professor?
I have had 4. I'll answer that personally. I've had 4, and I will have a 5th soon.
Would you be prepared
I've not had COVID infection.
Would you be prepared to disclose your immunity register records?
I'm happy to. I've had both the AstraZeneca vaccine and I've had the Moderna vaccine, Senator. But,
and Professor Kelly,
I don't know what else.
I ask the same question of you.
I'm just electing to share that.
Senator, I think that's private.
Sorry, there's a bit that goes on after that, which is where the other two refuse and say this is private information, you shouldn't be asking this, and you're basically shut down there, Alex, simply for asking those questions. To your point about the bureaucracies being so powerful and now so politicised, you know, where is this going to end up? How does the average Australian get to, you know that their representatives in Parliament can actually control the bureaucracies?
Well, look, as I said earlier, Rowan, it gets, in my humble opinion, it gets through by people getting involved in the political process, by getting involved at grassroots level, at branch root level. I would love people in South Australia that are fed up to join me inside the party and to continue to build the membership, who go to AGMs, who build delegates to our state council, who elect people like Ben Hood, and we rinse and repeat. Those people then will have the job ahead of them to lean on the bureaucracy. You know, it's going to take hard decisions. There need to be cuts to these organisations. There needs to be, you know, the reins run in. And many of our previous ministers were very, very good. I think of Alan Tudge, who recently retired, who did an enormous job up against the force of King Solomon and the Education Department holding off wokeness. You know, I mean, it can be done. We just need to have strong ministers in there to do it, and that starts from getting the right people in, and that can't happen without support from the ground up. So that's the way it's got to work.
Well, Alex, you are certainly one of the right people. I'm certainly thrilled that you're there in Parliament, and so are many Australians, particularly South Australians. Thanks so much for chatting to us.